Rob Gentile, a strong man full of energy in his youth, was passionate about sports, but those intense games left their mark on his body. His youthful years, closely associated with football and extreme sports, resulted in injuries that persisted into his adulthood. One of these injuries was bone spurs growing in his neck, the result of various impacts and falls throughout his energetic years. The pain was relentless, gnawing away at Rob's health and spirit day by day. Living with it had become inevitable, but he knew he couldn't continue like this forever. In his quest to find relief from the pain, Rob came across a renowned doctor in Pittsburgh. This doctor, as people said, was a pioneer in treating spinal issues without the need for traditional, painful, and long-lasting methods. Rob was introduced to a new surgical procedure, a process where, instead of fully opening the back of the neck and fusing the discs together, they only needed to make a small incision in the front. The doctor would skillfully move the esophagus aside and proceed to the area that needed surgery to remove the bone spurs, causing the pain. It sounded like a miracle to Rob, and he did not hesitate to agree. After undergoing the necessary tests, he was prepared for the surgery. True to the rumors, the surgery was quick and smooth. Rob only needed to stay in the hospital for one night for monitoring and was then allowed to return home. He thought his life had turned a new page, free from the nagging neck pain. However, little did he know that the worst was yet to come. 4 days after returning home in North Carolina, at 11 p.m., Rob was suddenly struck by a severe chest pain. Without any prior warning, the pain hit like lightning from a clear sky. Everything had seemed normal that day. Rob had not done anything unusual, had not faced excessive stress, but his heart suddenly attacked him in a brutal manner. Sudden and excruciating, he knew this wasn't an ordinary pain. Rob's heart was sending an urgent signal. Rob's wife, who was sleeping beside him, was abruptly awakened by strange sounds and his screams. At first, still half asleep, she thought it might be their daughter, a special needs child, having a seizure. But when she fully woke up, she realized it was Rob who was lying in bed, violently convulsing and crying out in pain. In that moment, everything became chaotic. She immediately called for an ambulance. It only took about 3 miles for the ambulance to reach the nearest hospital, but for Rob that time seemed endless. He had fallen into unconsciousness, no longer feeling the pain or the panic around him. It was just a dense, dark void engulfing him. Meanwhile, the emergency team rushed him into the emergency room and began treating him with blood thinners to stabilize the situation. Rob's wife stood outside the hospital room, filled with extreme anxiety. She could do nothing but pray and wait for the doctors to provide updates. A nurse approached her, reassuring her that Rob's condition had been stabilized thanks to the medication and support devices, and that they just needed to wait for the cardiologist. But then the unimaginable happened. Shortly after the nurse said that the situation seemed stable, Rob suddenly shot up from the hospital bed with a strange force. His wife later recalled that the scene was like something out of a horror movie. His body seemed to be pulled up by an invisible force, his eyes wide open, full of panic and fear. In that moment, he screamed out the name Frosty, the nickname of his late brother-in-law. After shouting the name, Rob collapsed back onto the bed, his body going completely still. The heart monitor displayed a long, flat line. Rob had entered cardiac arrest. The hospital went into full alert, alarms blaring throughout the facility, and a whole team of doctors rushed into the room to begin resuscitating him. The entire room became a battlefield, with doctors and nurses doing everything they could to bring Rob back. They administered multiple electric shocks, injected epinephrine directly into his heart, but all efforts seemed futile. Rob showed no signs of life, his body seemingly completely giving up. In that moment, Rob's wife was on the verge of collapse. She pleaded with the doctors, telling them they couldn't lose him. She spoke of their special needs child who required his care and how she couldn't handle everything on her own. She begged the doctors to keep trying. The medical team did everything within their power. After more than 20 minutes of resuscitation efforts with no success, it seemed like Rob wasn't coming back. But something compelled Dr. Patel, the lead doctor, not to give up. Whether it was a spiritual feeling or a belief in miracles, she kept trying. And then, a miracle happened. Rob finally had a faint pulse. Though it wasn't a full recovery, it was a sign of life. The doctors immediately performed 2 stent placements in his arteries to restore blood flow. However, the damage was already too great, and Rob went into cardiogenic shock. Rob was then intubated to help him breathe, and fell into a coma for the next 4 days. During the 4 days that Rob Gentile was in a coma, time seemed to pass slowly for his family. His wife, along with other family members, remained by his bedside, constantly hoping for a miracle. However, as time dragged on, their hope grew dimmer. The doctors had done everything they could, but the reality was that Rob's condition showed no signs of improvement. He remained motionless in bed, entirely dependent on life-supporting equipment. On the 4th day, Rob's family was informed that they couldn't wait any longer. During those 4 days, neurologists had been brought in to check if Rob showed any signs of brain activity, to determine if he was brain dead. Unfortunately, the results were not promising. It seemed that Rob had truly lost all chances of recovery. A sense of helplessness engulfed Rob's wife, and the family began to face the painful reality that they might have to say goodbye to the husband, father, and brother they loved so dearly. In the final days of his treatment, Rob's oldest brother called a local priest to the hospital to perform the anointing of the sick, a rite in the Catholic faith known as extreme unction, a final prayer to prepare the soul of the dying for a peaceful passage into the afterlife. In his deep coma, Rob was unaware that the priest had stood by his bed, anointed his forehead with oil, and offered him a final prayer. As the 4th day came to an end, the doctors decided that they couldn't wait any longer. Rob had been intubated for the past 4 days, but now the doctors had to remove the breathing tube to see if he could breathe on his own. This was the life or death moment. If Rob couldn't breathe on his own, the family would have to accept the harsh truth that he wouldn't survive. The doctors began the process of removing the breathing tube. Meanwhile, Rob remained still, showing no signs of life. In the minds of the nurses and doctors, they were already preparing for the worst-case scenario. But then, something unexpected happened. As the breathing tube was removed, Rob suddenly began to react. He started choking, feeling as though he was drowning. A nurse in the room immediately shouted, trying to calm him down, saying that if he didn't breathe, there was nothing she could do to help. Despite his weakened state, Rob managed to regain control and began to breathe on his own. This event left the doctors and nurses in shock. To them, it was nothing short of a miracle. Though it was unclear whether Rob would make a full recovery, the mere fact that he could breathe without assistance was a major breakthrough. Rob was then moved back to the recovery room and gradually began to improve. In the early days after regaining consciousness, he was still very weak and unable to speak normally. His wife later recalled that Rob's voice at the time sounded like a child's, soft and high-pitched, completely different from the familiar voice she knew. When his wife approached the hospital bed, Rob turned to look at her with deep eyes and whispered something that sent a chill down her spine. "Melanie, you have to believe me. I saw Frosty." Hearing the name Frosty, Rob's wife was stunned. Frosty, their brother-in-law, had taken his own life just 7 weeks earlier. She remembered the horrifying moment when she found her brother lying dead in their parents' room, with a hunting rifle still warm in his hands. And now, Rob was saying that he had seen Frosty in a dream, or more precisely, in his near-death experience. Shocked, she asked Rob, What did Frosty say to you? Rob, his eyes still not fully clear, whispered, Frosty said he messed everything up, and he wants me to come back and help fix things. He also wants you to tell the family that he's in a good place. Rob's words left Melanie in disbelief. She tried to process what he was saying, but couldn't shake a feeling of eerie fear. 7 weeks earlier, Frosty had taken his own life in tragic circumstances. It had been a difficult time for him. He had just gone through a divorce and was facing financial struggles as his only daughter was in college. Frosty had previously struggled with drug addiction, but he had been clean for about 5 years. Yet, on that fateful night, overwhelmed by stress and exhaustion, Frosty decided to relapse and use drugs one last time to blow off steam. Unfortunately, he purchased a new drug from China called Flocka, an extremely dangerous substance that can drive users insane within minutes. After using it, Frosty returned home and, in a state of panic, took his own life with a hunting rifle. All his life, Rob had grown up with the Catholic faith, believing that suicide was a grave sin, an act that condemned the soul to eternal damnation in hell. Yet now, after his near-death experience, Rob was saying that Frosty was in a good place. This revelation shook the very foundation of Rob's beliefs about religion and God. He began to question whether a loving God would really condemn someone driven to despair, especially when they were no longer in their right mind, under the influence of drugs and psychological turmoil. This thought marked the first step in Rob's shift in consciousness. He realized that perhaps the religion he had believed in all his life wasn't quite what he thought. God, as Rob perceived him, was not a judgmental and punishing entity, but a source of infinite light and love for everyone, regardless of their mistakes. In the following days, Rob gradually recovered. He became more alert, and memories of his near-death experience started to become clearer. He not only recalled his encounter with Frosty, but also other deep moments from when he lay on the bed, teetering between life and death. After waking from the coma, Rob Gentile faced not only the challenge of recovering from his severely damaged body, but also the real battle between life and death. The doctors informed him that his heart had suffered irreparable damage. Even though he had miraculously survived, the chance of him staying alive without major intervention was extremely slim. To save Rob's life, he would need a new heart, and that meant he had to wait for a heart transplant. While waiting for a donated heart, the doctors decided to apply temporary measures to keep Rob alive. They equipped him with a special device called a defibrillator vest. This vest was designed to monitor Rob's heart rhythm, and whenever his heart stopped or fell into a dangerous state, it would immediately deliver an electric shock to restart his heart. Rob had to wear the vest all the time, even while sleeping. This made him feel like he was living in a science fiction movie, with his body completely dependent on technology to stay alive. But that wasn't the only measure. The doctors also inserted a tube into Rob's chest, where they continuously pumped medication directly into his heart to keep it beating. This medication, called milrinone, was extremely powerful and helped stimulate his heart to function. However, milrinone wasn't a long-term solution. It could only keep his heart working for a certain period, and the doctors warned that Rob was living with a ticking time bomb. Each day, Rob's heart grew weaker, and there was no guarantee that he would survive long enough to receive a new heart. In the following days, Rob had to travel frequently between medical centers to assess whether he was a suitable candidate for a heart transplant. He visited several major hospitals in Charlotte and Raleigh, including the renowned Duke Medical Center, but the outlook wasn't promising. One of the only options the doctors suggested was the use of a left ventricular assist device, LVAD. This was a mechanical pump attached to the heart to help circulate blood throughout the body. However, it wasn't an ideal solution, especially for a 56-year-old man like Rob. He would have to live with wires and devices attached to his body, making him vulnerable to infections and greatly affecting his quality of life. Rob faced a difficult decision. He could either accept living with the LVAD or give up and wait for death to come naturally. Rob thought a lot about this. He was a father, a husband, and he didn't want to continue living in such a fragile state, but at the same time, he couldn't abandon his family. Ultimately, he decided that he wouldn't choose the LVAD. He would let things unfold naturally and face whatever came his way. With his decision made, Rob prepared to resign from his job at a major steel company headquartered in Chicago. He had worked for the company for many years and was one of their top salespeople. Rob called his boss to inform him about his health condition and told him that he could no longer continue working. It was an emotional call, and Rob was ready to close this chapter of his life. But then, something unexpected happened. Rob's boss, upon hearing the news about his condition, decided not to give up on Rob so easily. He reached out to Michael Tang, a philanthropist and businessman closely connected with the University of Chicago Hospital. Michael Tang had donated a significant amount of money for heart disease research and had a special passion for saving people with heart conditions. After hearing about Rob's case, Michael Tang decided to help. He spoke with the doctors at the University of Chicago Hospital, and they agreed to take Rob in as a candidate for a heart transplant. 2 days later, Rob and his wife flew to Chicago, embarking on a new journey with one last hope. When they arrived at the University of Chicago Hospital, Rob was greeted by Dr. Uriel, a renowned heart transplant specialist. Upon seeing Rob, Dr. Uriel couldn't believe his eyes. He told Rob that he couldn't understand how Rob was still walking around, but he assured him that they would do everything possible to save his life. Dr. Uriel explained that waiting for a donor heart was a difficult process, and with the limited supply of donated hearts, finding a suitable match wasn't guaranteed. But one fortunate thing was that Rob had come at the right time. While waiting for the heart, Rob met another remarkable figure, Dr. Juvenando, a renowned transplant surgeon who had been working with artificial heart devices for the past 15 years. Dr. Juvenando introduced Rob to a new device that was still in the experimental phase, called New Pulse. This device was compact, about the size of a lunchbox, and was designed to help patients stay alive while waiting for a donor heart. The New Pulse device worked by making a small incision in the chest and inserting a tiny balloon through the aorta where it would help circulate blood. The device was connected to a titanium disc placed behind the rib cage, with wires coming out to attach to the pump. Rob could carry the device with him and move around the hospital while waiting for a heart. This was the only option Dr. Juvenando could offer, and Rob decided to accept it. However, there was an interesting fact. Rob was the first patient to test this device. Up until that point, New Pulse had only been tested on animals like cows and pigs, but the trial data was very promising. Dr. Juvenando explained that they only needed to gather 3 weeks of data from Rob to submit the device to the FDA for approval. This made Rob feel a bit anxious, but he knew he had no other choice. It was his only chance to stay alive until a donor heart became available. Rob's decision to try New Pulse became a turning point in his journey. After the device was implanted, Rob could move more freely and began to feel a glimmer of hope. The device worked well, and Rob felt relieved knowing that, even though he was still living with a ticking time bomb, at least he had gained more time. Although the New Pulse device was keeping Rob Gentile alive, he could still feel his body growing weaker. After months of waiting in the hospital, Rob experienced not only physical pain, but also a spiritual crisis. He gradually realized that his heart was not just biologically exhausted, but also spiritually fatigued. He had faced painful memories, difficult decisions, and prolonged despair. However, on that fateful night, when a violent storm raged outside the hospital, Rob went through what he later called the dark night of the soul. In his hospital room on the 8th floor, overlooking Lake Michigan, Rob lay there in the dark of the night. The storm outside grew more intense, with flashes of lightning and heavy rain pounding against the windows. The sound of howling wind and the steady patter of rain seemed to echo the fear and helplessness within Rob. His mind was swept up in a torrent of thoughts about past mistakes, missed opportunities, and regrets over not living life to the fullest. That inner despair quickly became a storm within him, causing his heart to fall into dangerous arrhythmia. His heart beat so fast that a nurse had to rush into the room to administer medication to control his heart rate. After the nurse left, Rob remained there, completely exhausted and drained. He had fought for too long, endured too much, and had no strength left to continue. It felt as though his soul was slipping away from his body, as if all the remaining life force within him was drifting away with the storm outside. In that moment, Rob stopped resisting. He closed his eyes and whispered, "God, do whatever you will. I can't fight anymore." And then a miracle happened. Rob felt himself drifting out of his body, as though he were standing outside, looking at himself. He could clearly see his frail body, lying motionless on the hospital bed, connected to medical devices. He realized that he was now just a small, weak figure, but he also understood that this was not the end. In that moment, Rob felt as if all the tiny particles of his being were swept into a strong wind, scattering across the vast universe. He no longer felt heavy or in pain, but instead, a lightness and tranquility he had never experienced before. Rob stood in a boundless void, looking out as if through the window of an airplane at a clear sky. There were no specific objects around him, but neither was there emptiness. He sensed a deep connection with the universe, with everything. In that space, Rob realized that he was not just a physical body, but a part of the universe's energy. He no longer perceived the world through senses like smell, touch, or hearing, but rather understood everything in a completely different way, through a deep, refined awareness of the soul. In that space, Rob didn't see the religious images he had expected, such as angels or Jesus. Instead, he felt the presence of an eternal source of energy, filled with love and light. He felt as though he was being merged with this energy, a great force that encompassed the entire universe. It was an absolute feeling of love and protection. As Rob stood in that vast space, he began to see complex structures, like interwoven strands of light, forming a massive web. That web was made up of trillions upon trillions of tiny beams of light, crossing each other like neurons in the human brain. Rob realized that each beam of light represented a part of the universe, and that everything was connected. He understood that all of us, humans, all living creatures, the stars, even every speck of dust, are part of this eternal network of light. In that moment, Rob no longer felt alone. He understood that we are all connected, that loneliness is merely an illusion. Everyone is part of the whole, and every action, every decision has an impact on others. He saw his life play out like a film in reverse, where every mistake, every bad decision he had made was laid bare before him. He felt regret over the judgments he had passed on others and on himself. Within the web of light, Rob began to see familiar faces, people he had judged or had negative thoughts about. Interestingly, he didn't just see their current images, but also their past, the events in their lives that had shaped them. He understood that each person carries their own unique journey, and no one can truly judge another without knowing their full life story. But the most special part of this experience was when Rob saw his daughter, Maria. In the physical world, Maria was a special needs child, unable to speak or communicate normally with her parents throughout her life. But in this spiritual realm, Maria appeared before Rob as a perfect, healthy, radiant being. She was no longer confined by her frail physical body. Maria stood there, completely free and strong, with light emanating from her, illuminating the space around her. Rob was deeply moved when he saw his daughter in this state. In their current life, he and his wife had done everything they could to care for Maria, but they always felt helpless against the seizures and pain she endured. Rob had prayed many times, asking God to release Maria from her suffering. And now, standing before her in this infinite space, Rob felt a lightness and peace he had never known. Rob looked at Maria, and in his mind, he asked, "Maria, what do you want me to do to help you? I've tried everything, but I don't know how to ease your pain anymore." And then in the unspoken language of the spiritual world, Maria replied to Rob with 3 simple words, "Just love me." Those 3 words changed Rob's life. He felt the unconditional love that Maria sent to him, and he understood that the most important thing in this life wasn't trying to fix everything, but love. Rob realized that his greatest mission in life was to love, not just Maria, but everyone and everything in the universe. When Rob woke from this experience, he had a profound awareness of the importance of love and connection. He realized that each of us carries a divine spark within, and our mission in this life is to let that light shine and spread. This experience not only changed Rob's life, but also clarified his purpose: to live true to his loving and connected nature.